Welcome to this edition of the Barnsley Startup Meetup videocast with Peter Wright of Digital Law, based here in the DMC. Peter's going to be doing a talk at the next Startup Meetup event in the DMC2 later on in July. And he's going to be taking us through some legislation that's coming in the US around TikTok and the potential for it to be banned and what that could mean as a knock-on for the rest of the rest of the world. Do you want to just take a couple of minutes to tell us a bit about yourself, Peter? Welcome, first off.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor. Don't know that put you off. I've now been running digital law for 10 years. I've been a solicitor for 20 years. Digital law is 10 years old. We've been based here at the Digital Media Centre for the entirety of that 10-year period. And we try and do, as the name on the tin suggests, everything when it comes to providing legal advice around the use of technology. So everything from the use of websites, apps, development, things like software licensing, as well as if you're basically trying to sell goods and services online. It could be through a website, so you'd need terms of sale. It could be through an app. It could be that you're trying to get onto, the App Store, etc. We work with a lot of our clients to help them when it comes to that sort of sale and supply of goods and services using digital technology. So we do a lot of advice around things like data protection, cyber security, and when I say cyber security, I mean the regulatory compliance piece on that. So if you want to be able to say to a regulator, we've done everything we could to show that we've looked after our data, we've looked after our systems, we've done the best we could, and being able to demonstrate that evidentially, that's what we help our clients to do.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So, leaning into that a little bit, you mentioned that you've been a solicitor for 20 years and you started digital law 10 years ago. What was the inspiration behind that? What was the motivation?
Oh, good question. So initially after I qualified, I worked for a couple of the sort of larger national firms. Ended up doing quite a bit of advice actually for at the top, what was at the time Her Majesty's Government, one of their government departments. I was doing a lot of work there through one of the large law firms I worked at, and as part of that particular, it was a big piece of litigation I was working on worth billions of pounds to the UK Exchequer, basically. So in the course of defending that, we started doing a lot of work on records and data and management. And this was around, bear in mind, sort of 2009, 2010. And I could see at that point we were doing a lot of work under what was at the time the Data Protection Act 1998. We were doing a lot of work around freedom of information. We were doing a lot of work in the context of that particular case as well, that was starting to look at sort of social media and how that was being used from a publicity perspective, but also already starting to go into that element of what people were saying and doing on social media. And I sort of took that as a package and thought, you can see a direction of travel here. You can see an emerging specialism with regards to helping people and businesses and showing what needs to be done when it comes to doing business on this medium. And there were not at that time many, if any, law firms actually turning around and saying, we can help you in this sphere. They'd dress it up as, oh, we do IP or IT, but it didn't really go to the nub of what is it you actually do, how do you help people. So I ended up starting digital law, and we were authorised in 2014 with a view to then being able to package all of those services under sort of one banner, under one heading. And that's meant we've sort of surfed this wave in the ensuing 10 years of the growth of technology, its massive import to the economy as a whole. So we work with a load of clients across both UK, Europe, US, Middle East and Asia, doing everything from even sometimes just acting as their data protection officers. We will sort of say, look, we can handle all of this stuff, and on a monthly basis we'll sort of work and help you to make sure you're complying with everything you need to do under what, of course, now is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, Data Protection Act 2018 and UK GDPR in the UK, and then of course emerging legislation now in different countries around the world, where they're all looking at different standards that they want to have when it comes to doing business online. So, we end up helping a lot of businesses that are coming to the UK, But at the same time, we help a lot of other UK businesses as they might be saying, look, we're going into Europe, we're going into America, we want to go into, some of the Gulf states. All these sorts of things are the sorts of things that we then help our clients to do.
Awesome. So, talking about the global element of the work that you do, presumably you get to see quite a lot around states or countries that are particularly progressive around their digital strategy and their digital law, as well as states that are not quite progressive. Where do you think it's easiest? Like, when I say easiest, I mean as in, which are the easiest states to deal with in terms of the clarity of their strategy and how to address it?
Well, it's not as clear cut in many ways as it may, I suppose, at first be thought of, in that some countries are a lot more digital focused than may be apparent. Some of the Baltic states, for example, are incredibly good with regards to not just the environment they've created for sort of tech entrepreneurs, but even actually delivering some key government services using digital technology and making massive savings and efficiencies.
I was going to say that. I think, is it Estonia? That's
Yes.
like one of those random countries that you just think, well, how did that happen? But actually, they've gone almost entirely digital.
They have. I mean, I don't know if it's the fact that, for example, the UK, Mother of Parliament's a very, a state that is always very much, well, this is the way it's always been done, and sometimes a little bit resistant to change, whereas, of course, the more emerging nations in Eastern Europe who ended up having thrown off the sort of shackles of communism didn't, I suppose, have quite as much history and legacy of, well, this is how we need to do it. I think they were a bit more forward focused and thinking, well, how do we do this in the best way to look after our people? And they've done that. Yeah. But, I mean, one of the big, I think, misconceptions is that people think, for example, oh, well, in Europe, it's within the single market and everything's all the same. It really isn't.
Right.
So I was doing a panel just a few weeks back at Legal Tech Talk in London at the Intercontinental O2, and I had a specialist from Africa and a specialist from California, all legal technologists, and also a specialist from Germany who now does most of her work in New York. But she was saying, only this year have they created the environment in Germany where you can actually now go and set up your company digitally online. Really? Before that, it was like this sort of Gilliam-esque bureaucratic nightmare where you had to sort of go along and get documents sworn and witnessed and notarized, not to mention having to pay quite an insane amount of money, whereas, of course, in the UK, which we love to give a good kicking to our institutions in the UK, but actually, I used Companies House 10 years ago to set up digital law, and the wasn't perfect, don't get me wrong, but I could do it, and it cost about 30 quid, if memory serves, and it was a fairly straightforward exercise, and you suddenly realise that going to other countries that isn't necessarily the case. And the fact that she was saying this about Germany, where we tend to think, oh, it's all very efficient, and we have this sort of mental image of a very efficient Germany, and yet in fact it was quite Byzantine in the way it was structured. And as I say, people tend to think, oh, well, surely that's the same across Europe, and you tend to find, well, even in Germany, Bavaria is different to Schleswig-Holstein, which is different to Westphalia and all these different areas within the Federal Republic of Germany. Before you then look at the fact that even when it comes to data protection, a lot of people think, oh well, it's GDPR, it's pan-European. Well, no, because the way it's enforced and regulated by the different regulators means you've actually got quite a different flavour of how that data protection law works in, say, Italy. Or France, compared to, again, what you get in some of those individual federal states within Germany. So there is massive variation in a way that I think sometimes externally, as the UK now is from the EU, that we don't necessarily appreciate. We just think, oh, it's all the single market, it's all the customs union, it's all the same. It really isn't.
Yeah. Awesome. So over the last 10 years, presumably, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on data resilience or business resilience, I guess, from a digital point of view, because it's huge, isn't it? Really, you hear horror stories about businesses where they didn't have their data redundancies backed up in a couple of different places, and they were either hacked or they lost their data center and therefore effectively lost their business. Do you see a lot of the same issues being repeated across the board? And if so, which is the most common?
Good question. So one of the big problems that you get with some of the larger organisations actually is that very often they've got issues with regards to their legacy systems, i.e. old IT systems that were commissioned in the 90s or the early 2000s that were then not really built to handle the volume of data that they now do, and certainly weren't built with an eye to the sort of advanced persistent threats we now get from a security perspective now. And it's like, well, why is this still a problem? Well, very often you've got systems that aren't, unfortunately, very often people aren't starting off with a clean sheet of paper. It'll be, well, in the 90s we had this system, and then we bolted this on, and then we've added on this other thing. And very often behind what can look like a very slick, all-singing, all-dancing system, you actually find that these old bits that are almost sort of, a hamster in a wheel is still turning to keep this system running, but for various reasons they can't retire it, even though sometimes it isn't even being supported now by its original manufacturer. And you sometimes find that actually has created a significant vulnerability, and that's where very often systems end up falling over or being compromised because of either this older legacy tech or a compromise that's been taken elsewhere in a system to accommodate this piece of legacy tech. So that's where you sometimes find that there's a commonality in terms of a problem, and that sometimes develops because you've then got, a board will look at this. Usually you've got a board, chief executive, they may end up devolving some of they might go, I'm not sure about tech, they devolve it to a chief technology officer. The technology officer says, well, I'm not entirely sure about how security works, I'll devolve that to a chief information security officer. And they, to be honest, sometimes they may not be fully on top of these sort of overarching issues. And you end up getting decisions that seem easier from a cost perspective to just say, well, let's just add on this, let's just add on that, rather than just go out saying, let's just put a line through all this, migrate to a new system that actually works for us and our customers and our services going forwards. But unfortunately, you then look at what happened with TSB a few years ago, where they tried to do that with a moderate-sized bank, and the whole system collapsed. So you can see why sometimes people don't want to take that decision because it looks like it's more high risk. But this means that we have, as I say, systems that are a bit more of a hodgepodge that end up being, for larger organisations, more vulnerable to that exploitation, which we then read about on a regular basis.
Yeah, the one that springs to mind is the NHS a couple of years ago where they still had Windows 95 machines, and they were compromised, and there was a big furore about that. But you can see quite easily how it happens. I guess the question you get asked quite a lot now these days, Peter, is AI. Yes. Has that changed what you do as a business? And has it changed what people are asking you as a business?
Yes. So even just from a security perspective, the greater use of AI is meaning that systems need to be more secure than ever, because the threats they face are evolving and developing all the time thanks to AI. And indeed, it was largely down to the development of AI that you've actually got a greater degree of automated attacks out there that are happening all the time. And then automated defences, when you look at some of the defence systems that are out there from dark trace, etc., an awful lot of that is powered by quite sophisticated AI. So it's almost like that's been where the arms race has taken place. Yeah. And then the rest of us start to develop, start to benefit from some of the things that are developed as almost having been perfected in that field that has developed this more sophisticated AI. It does get a bit more scary when you think about sort of the machines battling the machines to get into our systems. But there you go. That's the reality of how it's happened. We help a lot of our clients now when it comes to they're saying, oh, we're going to use AI for this, that, or the other. depending on the field that they're in, we'll be saying, well, think quite carefully about that in terms of what you're going to use it for. The advice always remains, do not put anything with personal data on it anywhere near AI, particularly if you're just using ChatGPT to generate text or whatever for you. So you shouldn't be putting information in there about your contacts, your clients, employees, all that sort of stuff. Make sure any identifying personal data is well away from it, because the systems simply aren't designed to hold that and to be compliant. A system designed in California isn't going to really be built with European data protection law in mind. So there's that risk. It is, of course, very, very powerful to use it in the right ways. So very often we've ended up actually helping our clients when they've said, look, we've got our developers who want to use ChatGPT for wider system development. If they're doing that, strictly speaking, there should be hardly any personal data going into that, because that's not what coding is about. That's just developing from what was very advanced cutting and pasting to now just generating large tranches of it using AI. So if it's used within those confines, provide you give, and this is what we try and do, we try and give our clients the guide rails to say, eat your heart out, use it in these great innovative ways, and then keep well away from the areas where there might otherwise be more in the way of problems when it comes to certainly the use of personal data, or issues with regards to more sort of a security or compliance perspective. So there's that element to it, and of course everyone's wanting to use AI to access the innovation, the benefits and the savings it can bring. So that's sort of developing and evolving all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, I was reading an article, you read articles about it all the time at the moment, but I was reading a specific article earlier this week where they were talking about leadership and how you build AI into your strategy, and how it's no longer the confines of a chief technical officer or the IT department. It affects the whole business, and therefore it needs to be a board level strategy around how to best deploy it. But they weren't talking about the fact that it was a kind of question and answers thing, and they weren't talking necessarily about the company and the colleagues within the team, within the company using it. They were talking about how you it was almost command and conquer from that kind of approach, or command and control, should I say.
Yes. Yeah.
And my thoughts on that really are just, even if you don't want to accept it, your team, your employees, your colleagues, your business are already using AI, and you need to identify how they're using it so you can best mitigate the issues around, like you say, giving good guidance and clear instructions on what you are allowed to put in a prompt text box and what you aren't, and all of those sorts of things. And it's not a case of you're not allowed to use this. It's very much a case of this is how you can use it to benefit yourself and also the business.
And it's interesting how the approach to the use of AI is already quite different, for example, in the UK compared to the EU.
Right.
So in the EU, you've now got an AI Act that is coming in that actually introduces quite a high degree of regulation, whereas there's no bespoke AI regulation yet. It's just been a matter of taking some of our existing laws and saying, well, these apply in the same way to this system or systems as they would to other bits of technology that have evolved and been used over time. So the UK Information Commissioner, John Edwards, has said, well, look, we still have laws around automated processing and how and when that should be used, and automated decision making, as well as how and when personal data should be gathered, used, processed, stored, transmitted. So that same regulatory matrix applies to AI as it does to everything else. So it's very much a matter of they're just saying, well, take the existing laws and apply those, without necessarily potentially going a little bit too heavy-handed, because it is increasingly being seen that actually having too extreme a level of regulation in Europe could actually crush and stop innovation where it should be happening. And we look at how important the technology and digital sectors are now to modern economies, particularly, say, for example, in the G7, and you think if you're actually going to have any discernible growth, you need to have it in that sector. So it's obviously early days still, but I think it remains to be seen how much of an effect that model of regulation has on the growth of those sectors in those EU states. And in comparison, you then go to the US, where you've got OpenAI pushing on and on and on, wanting to get to this bright new AI future, and not really worried about any potential consequences. It's more like, let's get there and work out the problems afterwards. Which is really an increase on the model that Mark Zuckerberg always had. Move fast, break things, doesn't matter, let's get there, sort out the problems afterwards. Well, we've spent the last 10 years sorting out the problems with social media, and they're not going away.
No.
And we wonder, well, is that going to lead to similar things when it comes to AI, potentially? It's going to be a matter of watch this space. But for the time being, it's going to be interesting to see from that regulatory perspective what we get. And indeed, we're recording this now, there is more than likely going to be a new government in place in the UK. And what will their priority be when it comes to AI? Their manifesto doesn't really say an awful lot about that, apart from making a few nice words and sentiments. It doesn't really say, we're going to introduce this, we're going to regulate that. So it's going to be really a little bit like a bit of a magic box that we open up and find out in the coming months.
Yeah, exciting times. On the podcast, Peter, I have a tradition, which was started with the first one that I did with Ben Hawley many months back now, and it's to ask a specific question, and that is, what's your ultimate sandwich?
Wow, and I didn't even get a chance to prep for this. And the reason why I would have prepped is there's actually the very boring answer to this is that I can't eat bread.
Oh, no way. So you have it rabbit style.
It isn't like a gluten intolerance. It's more of a sort of intolerance when it comes to a lot of the yeasts in processed bread. And for years I used to be one of these sort of middle-aged men who'd be, oh no, I've got indigestion, or I'm reaching for the antacid or the Rennies or whatever. And then my wife sort of said, well, let's work out what it is that's making you feel like this. And it turned out it was when I was eating bread. Oh, wow. So consequently, it's not as though sitting down and making a sandwich, I'm afraid, is something I tend to do. But I am able to do things like flatbreads.
Oh, right, okay.
And I do like going over and having like the shawarma in the glass house. Nice. From here, so you can sit down there. So stuff like that.
I'll admit shawarma as a sandwich. That's definitely like an option. I like it.
But that's sort of, in particular, that sort of Greek and Turkish,
gyros,
and a lot of the sort of North African foods that are more that sort of nice flatbreads and things. I love those as a result, just because I say my use of generally Western bread is somewhat limited.
Fair dues. Oh, that's good. I like that. It's good to have diversity on the podcast.
Well, there you go, right? You know, we aim to please. Yeah.
Awesome. And so finally, really, obviously, we've got the Startup Meetup, the next event coming up on the 11th of July.
Yes.
You'll be joining us to deliver a talk about TikTok, like I mentioned at the start. Yep. Do you want to go into a little bit of detail about
Absolutely.
About what
and for those who want to know a bit more on this, obviously come along to the event, and I'll also be putting together a sort of a written piece on this as well, for those who want to read into it in a bit more detail. But in short order, what I'm wanting to do is publicise a little bit, I think, the risk to the TikTok platform in particular, because I know a lot of people have had great success for their businesses promoting them using TikTok. They've built up huge numbers of followers. In some instances, they're getting great numbers of in terms of revenue from TikTok itself. It's very generous in that regard compared to some of the other platforms, so why wouldn't you? The algorithm means that video is served in a way that some people have then been able to, have some very successful businesses off the back of it. There's that baked potato stand that's got people flying in from all around the world to sample their baked potatoes. Such is the power of this thing. And my concern is that literally, having spent all this time and building up these wonderful followings and producing these wonderful videos, through no fault of their own, all of these content creators may suddenly find that their account is dulled and switched off, and you've got no access to your content, and you lose all of your followers. Why could that happen? Well, the long and the short of it is a piece of legislation that's coming in the States, It's with regards to the ownership of TikTok, which even though it is US investors, a US board, the ultimate beneficial ownership is in China. And the geopolitical situation means that the US government, or certainly US Congress, has convinced itself that this is a risk and could take a fairly apocalyptic step on that. And then there's also the geopolitical following of that from a lot of the other, certainly G7 countries, certainly from countries in the EU. And you might be thinking, well, hang on, what about this? Well, come on, if that's, you've got that interest in, you might have a different point of view, come along to the event and we'll have a chat about it. But from what's written on the face of this piece of legislation and what has happened when other security threats in relation to China have come up, I think we have significant cause for concern. And it could be the case that within 6 to 12 months, TikTok is gone. And that'll be like it is in India. TikTok was banned there before the pandemic. And it could well be the case that more countries now follow suit. So there is precedent for this, folks. And, you know, I think it's a matter of now making sure that you haven't got all your eggs in the TikTok basket, basically.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that, Peter, and thank you very much for your time today. And it sounds like a really interesting talk. Definitely get yourself down to the DMC2 in Barnsley on the 11th of July to catch that talk. Thanks.
Thank you.